November 20th, 1943, 06:12 a.m. Baitio, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The morning arrived like a furnace pressing down on the reefs. Sea spray hissed against corroded steel and sand, and the smell of diesel and cordite braided with the wet stink of human fear. Sergeant John Jack Mullins rode low in the bow of an LVT, sweat beating beneath his helmet as the landing ramp clanged open and men spilled onto the black sand. He had the weight of the world on his shoulders, an M1 Garand cradled ready, a map clamped to his thigh, and on his left hip a canvas pouch holding something small and almost ridiculous looking. A radio no bigger than a soldier's mess kit, its telescoping antenna folded against the leather strap. The men called it the Handie-Talkie, when they hadn't yet learned to use the proper call sign, SCR 536. Around Mullins, the beach turned into a throat of fire and chaos. Waves whipped up and smacked the corals, tossing men like fragile boats. The coral spit men into the surf, men who'd trained for months but hadn't trained to have the noise of mortars rip their names out of the air. Japanese pillboxes crouched like granite mouths along the seawall, slits of black where machine guns spat steel. Bodies lay in the surf and in the hollows between bunkers, boots, helmets, and the odd glint of a life still moving. Captain Edward Ned Hayes, his shirt torn and face streaked with salt and sand, barked orders and tried to form a line beneath a sky gone white with smoke. Mullins had been given the SCR 536 only the night before, on a rain-slick pier in Honolulu. The radio was a compact paradox, a wooden box roughly the size of a lunch pail, covered in olive-drab canvas with a twist lock on its lid and a thin, brittle antenna that when extended seemed as if it might bend like a reed. It weighed less than a pack of rations but felt heavier when the bullets started to sing. He clipped the handset to his chest, thumb finding the push-to-talk button like second nature. The manual said its range was limited, a few miles in the open, less through coral and concrete, but in the surf that morning it felt like a miracle. Delta, this is Abel. Move left 2 paces and lay covering fire on bunker 3. I'll call in the bazooka team. Mullins spoke into the headset, his voice flat with focus. The sound did not carry across the beach as a shout would. It slipped into the thin wire of the radio, across the electromagnetic air, and into the ear of Private Thomas Reed trapped behind a rim of coral 200 yards away. Reed froze, then answered crisp, "Able copy. Bazooka team ready." The reply crackled, small but immediate, the words arriving without the delay of runners, without the risk of someone being cut down carrying paper into a hail of lead. On the bluffs above the landing, Japanese sentries looked down and flinched at the American noise. It wasn't the thunder of ships or the angry bark of mortars. It was a string of clipped commands threaded through a strange invisible cord. Lieutenant Masao Takahashi, perched beneath the shade of a leaning coconut, watched through a pair of lacquered binoculars. He had heard radios before, big rigs and armored cars, the clumsy telephone switchboards tucked in headquarters, but never something so small that a single-foot soldier could speak and be heard. He blinked, then frowned, and passed the binoculars to Corporal Hiroshi Sato. "They carry talking boxes," Sato murmured, the phrase tasting absurd even as he said it. "Like radios but tiny. The men speak and the others answer without leaving their holes." The disbelief in their voices was a kind of denial. For months, the Imperial Army had measured the enemy in numbers and tanks, in fuel trucks and supply lines. The notion that individual American infantry had a tether, a way to marshal fire and movement in real time, cut into the old math of attrition and surprise. Mullins kept talking, issuing short, modular orders. "Medic to Sector C, smoke on my mark. Forward, 2 men, suppress left face." Each phrase was economy itself. Time was the currency, and the Handie-Talkie converted it into action. A mortar team, hidden behind a cluster of ruined palmettos, signaled back a bearing for indirect fire. A forward observer's whispered correction adjusted the arc by degrees, and the rounds landed like judgment on a pillbox that had been shrugging off grenade and rifle for hours. The bunker's roar stuttered, then went quiet. Men who'd been pinned dared a look and then a crawl. From the Japanese perspective, the change was uncanny. Takahashi watched squads shift as if guided by a spirit. He saw American small groups form, break and cohere again like disciplined schools of fish. Orders that once took minutes to transmit by runner appeared in seconds. The Americans were choreographing their movements with an invisible hand. Sato swore softly. It is like they have one mind. There was fear in the understatement, not of souls but of a technology that made small units speak and act with the speed of headquarters. It wasn't flawless. The SCR-536 sputtered when the sea salt crusted its contacts, and batteries ran low under heavy use. Static filled the band when artillery fired, drowning commands in white noise, but the Handie-Talkies multiplied what a single soldier could do. Mullins directed men into dead space and out again, coordinated suppressing fire with creeping advances. And when a grenade went unexploded in a crater, he called the combat engineers who arrived with a clatter and took care of it. Each successful call was a small miracle. Each failure a reminder that technology could be brittle as flesh. As the day lengthened and the sun burned down, the island's geometry changed. Lines of Americans pushed inland, led not by distant staffs but by sergeants and corporals speaking into radios that fitted beneath a field jacket. Takahashi could not unsee it. The battlefield had contracted into a grid of voices and answers. For him and his men, trained to expect the slow cadence of commanders born on shouted orders and written dispatches, the immediacy of the Handie-Talkie felt like the future arriving early and loud. On the beach, with the tide pulling away the dark evidence of violence, Mullins lowered the radio, his lips raw from speaking. He could still hear the echo of a voice that had once been miles away, now close enough to crown the moment. Able to all units, secure the ridge. Watch for counterattack. Signal will be held open for 10 minutes. He thumbed the button once more and felt that small device, and no larger than a lunchbox, hum with purpose in his palm. It had changed the fight, and neither side would soon forget how. December 28, 1943. Cape Gloucester, New Britain. Rain fell in curtains thick enough to drown a sound. The jungle smelled of rot, gunpowder, and salt, the kind of humid closeness that glued a man's breath to his chest. Sergeant Mullins crouched beneath the dark canopy with 6 men of Baker Company, every inch of them slick with sweat and rain. The SCR-536 sat in his hand, rain beating on its metal casing, its antenna cutting a narrow silhouette against the dripping leaves. A voice crackled from within, distant, metallic, alive. Able 1 to Baker 2. Enemy movement on your left flank. Advise immediate reposition. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Alan Rice, perched half a kilometer away across a ravine. To Mullins, it was like hearing a ghost whisper in the middle of nowhere. He pressed the transmit key. Copy that, Able 1, adjusting position, over. The exchange took 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would have taken 30 minutes without it. Maybe an hour if a runner had to fight the jungle. Private O'Neill, his helmet streaked with mud, muttered under his breath. Feels like black magic. Sarge. Mullins grinned, teeth flashing white in the gloom. Yeah, well, it's our kind of magic. They moved. 7 figures fading into ferns and rain, rifles held high, the radio murmuring softly like a mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the tree line, Japanese soldiers of the 141st Regiment watched the jungle twitch and ripple. Corporal Sato, now hardened by months of attrition and sleeplessness, pressed a pair of binoculars to his eyes. His uniform, soaked to the bone, hung like paper. Through the dripping palms he saw shapes move, almost invisibly, and then the sound came, not a battle cry, not even shouting, but the coordinated pop of rifle fire in short, timed bursts. He turned to his sergeant. They're talking again. They don't shout orders. The older man frowned. Impossible. No field telephones here. But even as he spoke, another squad of Americans, somewhere unseen, answered that rifle fire perfectly, like the echo of a single hand clapping. The SCR-536 wasn't just a tool, it was a multiplier. It stitched the battlefield together with invisible thread. A corporal pinned behind a log could whisper into the handset, and moments later mortar rounds would fall on a ridge beyond sight. Fire teams could pivot, retreat, or advance in rhythm. Each movement echoed across unseen lines of communication. For the Japanese, trained in a doctrine of fixed command and rigid hierarchy, it was maddening. In one engagement near a flooded river crossing, Sato's platoon ambushed what they believed to be an isolated American patrol. 5 men cut off by mud and jungle. They fired from cover, rifles cracking, machine guns spitting sparks through the rain. 3 Americans went down immediately. Sato ordered a rush. Then the jungle answered, mortar fire accurate to the meter. A curtain of shells descended in a matter of seconds. The Americans they had pinned down were no longer alone. Invisible voices had reached across the valley and called death out of the fog. By the time the echo faded, Sato's squad was gone. 3 dead, the rest scattered and bleeding into the mud. Later, in a half-collapsed bunker, Sato found one of the small radios. It had been dropped by a Marine killed in the same firefight. Its antenna bent, its casing cracked open like a metal fruit. Sato picked it up carefully, studying the exposed circuits and glass vacuum tubes. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its surprising weight, its simplicity. A Japanese engineer back at regimental headquarters examined it days later. He drew diagrams, traced the wires, noted the serial number. His report was incredulous. It is a complete radio transceiver, handheld, independent of vehicle or station. The Americans issue them to individual soldiers. Range approximately 2 miles. Weight, less than 6 pounds. Uses dry cell batteries. Unthinkable. They sent the fragments back to Rabaul for further study, but by then, the lesson had already been written on the battlefield. Coordination was a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Back in the dripping green, Mullins crouched beneath a poncho, listening to the steady hiss of static. The Handie-Talkie had survived another mission, though barely. Its batteries were fading, its casing scuffed by the elements. He reached into his pack and wrapped it in oilcloth before stowing it again. Private O'Neill lit a cigarette under his helmet and asked quietly, "You think they even understand how it works?" Mullins looked out into the wet dark, listening to the thunder and the far-off pop of sporadic fire. "No," he said finally. "And that's why it scares the hell out of them." As night fell, the jungle came alive with whispers of frogs, insects, men, and radios, blurring the line between nature and machinery. For the first time in the Pacific, communication itself had become a kind of weapon, one that turned the smallest unit into an army of voices. June 16, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The air smelled like cordite and burning palm sap. The beachhead had been taken, but the battle inland was chaos. A shifting ocean of fire and shrapnel where nothing stayed still for long. The terrain was a nightmare, sugarcane fields giving way to jagged ridges and coral slopes that swallowed boots and blood alike. Private First Class Harold. Bishop pressed his back against a chunk of blackened coral. The SCR 536 clenched in his hand. Its smooth metal casing was hot from the sun, but the voice inside was calm, impossibly calm for what surrounded them. Red 2, this is command. Enemy tanks approaching from North Ridge. Airstrike inbound in 60 seconds. Mark your position, over. Bishop glanced around. His squad was scattered, some in shell holes, others hugging the edge of the ridge. "We're not marked," he shouted. His sergeant, Jack Nolan, reached into his belt and pulled a yellow smoke grenade, striking it open and tossing it toward the clearing. "Tell 'em that's us," Nolan barked. Bishop pressed the transmit key, his voice shaking. "Command, we're yellow smoke on the ridge, yellow smoke." "Hurry the hell up, they're crawling on us." The radio hissed, and then a clipped reply. "Roger that, Red 2, keep your heads down." The airstrike came 30 seconds later. The ground rippled beneath them, heat washing across their faces as Corsairs screamed overhead, dropping ordnance with terrifying precision. The shockwave left Bishop deafened for moments, but when he looked up, the tanks were burning wrecks, their metal twisted and black. He looked at the small radio in disbelief. It had summoned the sky. Across the battlefield, the Japanese command bunker had been listening too. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanimoto of the 43rd Infantry Regiment gritted his teeth as he overheard American chatter. His communications officer shook his head, baffled. "Their messages, and they come from everywhere, sir. Not just command posts. Even infantry squads are transmitting." Tanimoto leaned over the map table. "Impossible. Those sets should be vehicle-mounted." "Not these," the operator said, voice low. "These are small, hand-carried. The Japanese were trained to rely on runners, flag signals, and field telephones. Communication was centralized, slow, and fragile. A single destroyed line could silence an entire company. But the Americans? They had turned every soldier into a node of command. By late afternoon, Tanimoto's men launched a counterattack across the ravine near Shiran-Kanoa. They charged under mortar fire, trying to flank a Marine position hidden in dense cane. But as soon as they advanced, the Marines shifted seamlessly. Fire and maneuver communicated in real time by voices over invisible wires. "Move right, 40 yards. 2 squads, flank 'em." "Copy, Baker 5 moving." Japanese soldiers who survived described it as fighting ghosts. Units appeared and vanished, firing from impossible angles, coordinating without visible signals. It wasn't luck. It was organization born from that 6-pound piece of American engineering. At dusk, Sergeant Nolan gathered his men in the ruins of a sugar mill. Their uniforms were torn, their faces blackened by soot. Bishop set the Handie-Talkie on an ammo crate. The device was battered, its casing dented, but the green indicator light still blinked faintly in the dark. Nolan squatted beside it, running a thumb over the letters stamped on its base. Signal Corps U.S. Army, SCR 536. He let out a low whistle. Hell, they should have given us these things back in boot camp. Would have saved half our platoon on Guadalcanal. Bishop nodded slowly. Feels like cheating, don't it? Nolan grinned tiredly. War ain't fair, kid. Not supposed to be. He picked up the radio again, thumb hovering over the transmit key. Somewhere up the chain, voices crackled. A captain calling for reports, a medic requesting an airlift, a pilot confirming fuel. To Nolan, it sounded like order in the middle of madness. Beyond the hill, a group of captured Japanese soldiers sat in the mud under guard. One of them, a young corporal missing his helmet, stared silently at the radio when it passed through his line of sight. His eyes widened as he realized that the Americans carried their headquarters in their hands. Later, when interrogated, he would describe it to his officers in disbelief. They speak into a small box, and men miles away obey. Their soldiers move like one creature with many hands. In that observation lay the grim truth of the Pacific War's new reality. Technology had become not just an advantage, but a doctrine, and in Saipan's burning fields, that doctrine was writing the future of modern warfare in smoke and static. July 1944, Imperial Army Headquarters, Tokyo. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. Maps were pinned across the walls. Arrows marking lost islands, encircled units, radio intercepts from the Solomons and the Marianas. A low hum of typewriters filled the air, punctuated by the sharp tap of boots on the wooden floor. Lieutenant Colonel Kenji Watanabe stood before a table cluttered with captured equipment, an American Thompson submachine gun, a dented canteen, and most curiously, a small rectangular object the size of a lunchbox. Its antenna had been extended like a thin steel whip. The officer beside him, a communications engineer named Captain Shiro Tanabe, gestured toward it with a mixture of awe and bitterness. This is what they call the SCR 536, he said. They're Handie-Talkie. We found it on Saipan. Still functional. He twisted the tuning dial and a faint hiss filled the room. Then a burst of static. A voice speaking in rapid English, a pilot checking his coordinates. Watanabe's brows knit in concentration. It still receives? He asked. Perfectly, sir. Even after weeks of exposure. Range of nearly 1 mile under combat conditions, sometimes more. They issue them to infantry squads, even to NCOs. Watanabe frowned. Even corporals? You mean to tell me each man can speak directly to command? Tanabe nodded gravely. It seems so. No need for field telephones, runners, or flag signals. They coordinate movements instantly. Around the room, other officers shifted uneasily. To them, the concept was unthinkable. Decentralization of authority, information flowing freely down the chain of command. In the Japanese army, such a system was not just alien. It bordered on insubordination. Orders were sacred, passed rigidly from superior to subordinate. The notion of a private speaking directly to higher command via machine was almost blasphemous. But war cared little for tradition. Tanabe continued, pulling a diagram from his briefcase, sketches of circuits, valves, and wiring. They use miniature vacuum tubes far smaller than ours. Light, efficient, durable. It operates on 5 channels pre-tuned so even a conscript can use it. He exhaled slowly. Sir, this is the future. Watanabe leaned closer, studying the black box as if it were a captured secret weapon. Perhaps, he murmured, this is how they outmaneuver us. Their squads act as if guided by one mind. While we send runners through artillery fire, they press a button and the sky answers. He paused, his gaze distant. Our men call them the soldiers who speak through the air. Thousands of miles away, aboard the USS Elmore, a convoy escort bound for Tinian, radio operator Sergeant Fred Mendez was laughing with his crew as he adjusted the same model radio. Things got more fight in it than we do, he joked, wiping sweat from his brow. Dropped it overboard once. Pulled it up, dried it off, still worked like a charm. The men chuckled, but there was truth in the humor. The SCR-536 wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline. Every landing, every jungle patrol, every night engagement, it was there humming quietly in the hands of a corporal or a radio man, bridging chaos with clarity. Back in Tokyo, Captain Tanabe made one final note in his report. This device eliminates the fog of battle. Where we rely on courage, they rely on communication. Courage breaks. Communication endures. The statement was considered provocative, even defeatist. Yet within months, Imperial engineers began experimenting with portable radio prototypes of their own. They were heavier, less reliable, and plagued by interference, but the spark had been lit. Still, it was too late for the Pacific War. On the islands that followed, Tinian, Peleliu, Leyte, the Americans moved with an eerie cohesion, squads flowing like limbs of one organism. Every ambush answered within seconds. Every artillery adjustment relayed before the enemy could react. The Japanese soldiers who survived these battles wrote later that the Americans seemed to hear each other's thoughts. They did not know it came from a little black box, smaller than a lunchbox. Watanabe, now stationed at Truk in late '44, would see the results firsthand. His regiment was encircled before they even understood the direction of attack. He would remember the faint, alien sound of English voices on the airwaves. Calm, clipped, confident, speaking of coordinates, flanking movements and victory, voices that seemed to float through the jungle like ghosts, guiding invisible hands of destruction. For the Imperial Army, it was not merely defeat on the ground, it was the collapse of an old philosophy. October 20th, 1944, the Philippines. Dawn cracked over the Leyte Gulf like a flare behind storm clouds. The beach was already thick with men, landing craft, and the oily haze of naval gunfire. American infantry from the 96th Division pushed inland through the wreckage. Palms splintered, smoke drifting low, machine gun chatter echoing from the tree line. Corporal David "Red" Callahan crouched behind a half-sunken Higgins boat. His SCR-536 clutched to his chest like a relic. The radio's metal casing was hot to the touch, sweat slicking his palms. "Able Company, this is Dog 2, he barked into the handset, voice taut but steady. "We're pinned near the coconut grove. Request smoke and a 60mm drop, grid mark Charlie 7. The reply came within seconds, crisp, confident, impossibly fast. "Dog 2 copy, smoke inbound. Hold position." A plume of white smoke erupted 50 yards ahead, curling like mist over the paddy field. Red glanced toward his squad. 10 men pressed against the sand, their helmets reflecting slivers of dawn light. "You hear that?" he shouted. "They heard us." The men laughed nervously. It seemed impossible that in this chaos of fire and mud, someone miles away could hear them so clearly. But that was the miracle of the SCR-536, a miracle forged in steel, vacuum tubes, and American ingenuity. Up the ridge, Japanese Lieutenant Taro Sakamoto peered through his field glasses. He had expected confusion, the kind that had plagued every amphibious invasion he'd fought since Guadalcanal. Instead, he saw precision. Small squads darted across open ground with uncanny timing, as if orchestrated by a single unseen commander. Every time his men repositioned, mortar fire followed within minutes as though the enemy could read their thoughts. He turned to his adjutant, voice tight. "How are they communicating?" "No wires, no signals." The adjutant shook his head. "We cut their lines, sir. Many times." Sakamoto lowered the glasses, the truth dawning with grim certainty. "They have no lines." Below, Red Callahan's team advanced again, guided by invisible voices. The radio man from battalion, a mile back, relayed air cover movements. A squad leader to the west warned of a machine gun nest. Each word, each breath traveled through the air like veins carrying blood through the Army's body. "Dog 2, pivot left, cover from the ridge." "Copy that, Able." In one synchronized movement, 3 platoons shifted positions, overwhelming a Japanese defensive pocket before they even realized they were outflanked. The battlefield had changed, not through brute strength or numbers, but through connection. Later, when night fell and the jungle quieted, Red sat by a flickering oil lamp examining his radio. Its paint was scratched, antenna bent, but it still hummed faintly. He smiled to himself. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. Across the valley, Lieutenant Sakamoto sat in the dark, writing his report by candlelight. The enemy moves as if guided by a single mind. Their small radios, handheld, connect them in ways we cannot match. Every counterattack we mount is met before it begins. Our runners are intercepted, our phones destroyed. Their coordination, it is unnatural. The Japanese command received his report but dismissed it as exaggeration. Yet across the Pacific, every surviving officer from Leyte, Peleliu, and Okinawa would later speak of the same thing. The voices in the air, the Americans' ability to act instantly, fluidly, as though their generals were standing beside every private on the field. By December, as torrential rains flooded the foxholes, Red's SCR-536 still worked. He used it to call in supplies, air cover, even Christmas greetings from the rear line. The sound of that tiny speaker had become as familiar as the sound of home. War had always been about weapons, rifles, tanks, planes. But for the first time, victory was carried not in the hand that pulled the trigger, but in the voice that called the shot. January 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The sun hung pale over the wreckage of a ruined sugar mill, its roof torn away, smoke rising like ghosts from the blackened earth. The fighting had moved north, but the air still trembled with the echo of artillery. Amid the rubble, Corporal Red Callahan knelt beside his battered SCR-536, its paint scuffed, its antenna bent, but still functional. He pressed the handset to his ear, listening to a voice crackle through the static. "Dog 2, you're clear for advance. Repeat, clear for advance. Good hunting." The words came from a mile away, maybe more, but they felt immediate, intimate, like a friend whispering across time. Red keyed his transmitter and replied, "Copy that, Abel, moving out." Then he paused, smiled faintly and added, "Thanks for the company." He didn't know it, but that exchange, simple, routine, represented a revolution in warfare. The SCR-536, the Handie-Talkie, had turned isolated squads into coordinated units, each voice linked in real time. What had once taken minutes, sometimes hours, now took seconds. And in those seconds, battles were won. In the jungle beyond, Japanese Lieutenant Taro Sakamoto watched through a slatted bunker window. He'd heard the stories, how the Americans spoke through boxes no larger than a lunch tin, how they could summon mortars, artillery, even airstrikes with a sentence. To his men, it seemed witchcraft. To him, it was science, deadly, efficient, and utterly beyond their reach. He turned to his radio man. "If we had such devices," he trailed off, shaking his head. Their own field sets were heavy, fragile, dependent on long wires and fixed positions. To use them in the field was to risk discovery. Meanwhile, the Americans moved like water, fluid, invisible, everywhere at once. Back at the command post, Captain Hayes stood over a map lit by the faint orange of a lantern. "This is the difference," he told his officers. "We don't have to wait for orders anymore. Every man out there can talk, can adapt. The war doesn't move top-down, it moves forward." Outside, the rain began to fall, pattering softly against canvas. Red adjusted the dial on his SCR-536, feeling the faint vibration of its internal tubes warming. Around him, the squad rested in the mud, half asleep, half alert. He could hear distant voices, the chatter of other units, the hum of coordination invisible to the enemy. "Dog 2, this is Abel. Sit tight. Resupply inbound." "Roger that." A few minutes later, the sound of jeep engines drifted through the mist. Supplies arrived almost on cue. Dry socks, tins of rations, and a new coil of antenna wire. For the soldiers, the Handie-Talkie wasn't just a tool. It was lifeline, command post, and comfort all in one. When word of the device reached Tokyo, engineers in the Imperial Army were astonished. Reports described a field radio small enough to fit in a single hand, powered by simple dry cells, rugged enough to survive sand, rain, and shrapnel. "Impossible," one officer wrote in disbelief. "No such technology can function without a large antenna or fixed base." Yet it did, and it was reshaping the war. By war's end, over 130,000 SCR-536 had been issued. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma, its presence had become as ubiquitous as the M1 rifle. The radio's voice had been the unseen heartbeat of Allied operations, the thread stitching together infantry, artillery, and air power into one synchronized force. Months later, when Red Callahan finally boarded a transport ship home, he carried the same battered SCR-536 in his pack. Souvenir, he said with a grin when the quartermaster asked why. But it wasn't just a souvenir. It was a symbol of survival, of connection, of the strange intimacy of modern war. In the years to come, the world would shrink around that idea. Radios would become smaller, faster, more personal. The soldier's voice, the human voice, would remain the most powerful weapon of all. And somewhere in the archives of forgotten battlefields, buried under vines and soil, the remnants of an SCR-536 would still hum faintly, whispering through static, "Dog 2, you're clear for advance."